interview with Brendan Ballou, a lawyer who's worked in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, where he served as special counsel focused on private equity, and now works in private practice, taking on cases involving worker and consumer harm. In this conversation, he breaks down how private equity works in plain terms, why the incentives can reward risk without accountability, and what that can mean for everyday services people rely on. You can read more about Brendan Ballou on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6degreesaway. Thank you and enjoy this interview.
How did you get into politics, and what first drew you to focus on private equity? Was there,
Sure. And
or
well,
was
thank
there,
you so much for having me. And I should say that, I wouldn't consider myself necessarily being in politics, given that I'm a lawyer, but I understand the thrust of the question. In terms of private equity, I was working in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, which handles, the review of companies buying other companies or companies conspiring with each other and things like that. And during the pandemic, I was reading about all these acquisitions, just in public materials, but reading about all these acquisitions of businesses by firms that I had never heard of. So, Blackstone, Carlyle, KKR, all these sorts of things. And it just seemed like these businesses were sort of taking over the world. And that got me interested in understanding what they were, which helped me understand private equity, which sent me down sort of this broader path.
very interesting. Something interesting within your work that I found that sort of stands out within other people I've interviewed is lots of people have or speak out regarding many different things like food safety or safety within, I don't know, trading platforms, not over trading. You're not manipulating people into over trading. But I think those people, they always tell me, oh, a policy change would be needed, but they're just writers. So who am I? But you as a lawyer, you sort of can get into it, which is very unique. So my next question is, in plain terms, how can private equity firms profit even when a portfolio company fails? And what does that mean for workers and consumers?
It's a great question, and thank you. So the basic problem with private equity, and maybe we should take a step back and just define what we mean by private equity, or at least what I mean. What I mean by it is a firm using a little bit of its own money, some investor money, but mostly borrowed money to buy up a business, and then owning it for a few years, trying to make some changes and trying to sell it for a profit a few years later. The sort of magic trick of private equity is that with all the borrowed money that's used to buy up these businesses, it's not the private equity firm that's responsible for paying back the debt. It's the company that's getting bought that's responsible for paying it back. It's a little bit like sort of a magic trick of getting to use somebody else's credit card, which goes into sort of the basic problems of private equity and why private equity firms often benefit even when their portfolio companies fail. So one of the challenges is that private equity firms tend to load the companies up with a lot of debt and then extract a whole bunch of fees from the company. So they'll, extract a fee every year or every quarter for the business's privilege of being owned by the private equity firm. Couple that with the debt and the fact that the private equity firm gets a big chunk of the profits of the business, but isn't necessarily responsible for the debt if they struggle to repay it, means it's a sort of heads I win, tails you lose sort of situation where the private equity firm can capture the benefit but walk away from the loss. There are other problems with private equity, but I would say that's the core issue in why there's sort of a disconnect between what's good for private equity firms and what's good for the businesses they buy and for their consumers and workers.
So within the large private equity companies that you mentioned, like Apollo or Blackstone, are there any good players or are they all bad apples?
It's a great question. So, I think that there are a lot of people in private equity that are trying to do the right thing. I think that there are a lot of private equity firms, especially smaller ones, that don't think of themselves as particularly extractive. So my critique is not necessarily about the people or even the intentions necessarily in private equity. But to get to your question, the challenges of private equity are baked into the business model. So, we just talked about debt and fees. Another basic problem that we have is that private equity firms are typically insulated from legal responsibility if something goes bad at the companies they buy. So if somebody dies at a nursing home that's owned by a private equity firm, it's very hard to sue the nursing home or sue the private equity firm, even if they are in some way responsible for the death. What that means is that structurally, private equity firms and the people in them are incentivized to take really risky strategies because, once again, they capture the benefit if things go well, but can walk away when things go badly. And I would say that that's something of a perversion of how capitalism should work. We want risk takers. We want people that are making big bets to try to improve the world. But we also have the intuition that people should be responsible for their bets. They get the benefit when things go well, they lose their money when things don't. Private equity kind of breaks up that basic idea.
What are common signs that a local business or service has been taken over by private equity, and how do communities usually feel the effects?
Yeah, so sometimes you'll see on Twitter, on social media, like a Scooby-Doo meme of somebody will say like, a business that's gotten really terrible. Let's see who's really behind this. They'll take off the mask and they'll say private equity. So one of the basic signs that a private equity firm may be involved in, let's say, your veterinary clinic, or your OBGYN or emergency medicine practice, is the quality of care decreasing? If you see things just generally declining in a way that you didn't expect, or at the same time seeing prices really go up very quickly, often that's a sign of new management, and often that's a sign of private equity new management. One of the good things is that while private equity firms rarely brand the businesses that they buy, so you won't see, a KKR branded veterinary clinic typically. You can really often just Google the business name and then private equity, and more often than not, you'll be able to see who the owner is. So if you start to suspect that something may be going on, it's generally pretty easy to understand whether a private equity firm was involved or not. To the second part of your question about how communities respond to it, it's a great question because I think one of the challenges that we have is that communities often feel really powerless to stop private equity acquisitions and roll-ups. And I'm sure we can talk about it more later, but I do think that there are things we can do as individuals, as states, as localities, to try to prevent sort of the excesses of private equity from hurting our communities.
Hmm. So what are the scale of these businesses that they're buying up? Are they mom and pops, or are they only large companies?
Yeah, it's a huge range. So it can range from, like you said, mom. Oh, do you need to take a break?
No, no, sorry, I need to give a charger back. Here you
Uh,
go. Sorry for the.
so you asked about sort of the range of acquisitions. It's a huge range, and it can range from literally the mom and pop shops that you're talking about. Oftentimes, private equity is a really attractive buyer for, let's say, a family-run dentist clinic or a family-run general practice, medical facility. So it can be very small. It can be gigantic, ranging in the tens of billions of dollars for an acquisition. So there's really no part of the economy that isn't in some way or in some degree touched by private equity firms.
Mhm. How have lobbying, tax policy, and regulation shaped a system that advantages private equity? And do you think we're living in a new Gilded Age?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The first Gilded Age was defined by, enormous corporations controlling, not just vast swaths of our economy, but vast swaths of our government. And arguably, these businesses got far too big to really not just be successful, but to function. There's only so much that one person at the top of a gigantic organization can know in order to effectively run an institution. And I would argue that we are seeing the same thing happen in private equity today. These numbers are a little out of date. I haven't been able to keep track of them, but if you considered them with their portfolio companies, the three largest private equity firms would be the third, fourth, and fifth largest employers in the United States, behind just Amazon and Walmart. So these are gigantic operations where it's really impossible to be efficient in a way that I think most people who support capitalism would want it to be. To your point about the relationship between private equity and government, Here again, I think there's a lot of overlap between the first Gilded Age and our age, in that private equity firms have been astoundingly successful at getting their way in Congress, in the executive branch, in the courts. And in large part, that's because of their ability to hire some of the most important former government officials. We're not just talking about your average congressman or senator. We're talking about former secretaries of the Treasury, Secretary of State and Defense, chair people of the, FCC and SEC, really, really important government folks, CIA directors and generals and so forth. As a result, I think private equity firms have been uniquely effective at getting their way in government, even more so than a lot of other really powerful industries. And I think that contributes, understandably, though I would argue not correctly, to a sense of, sort of helplessness or despair on the part of most people.
Mhm. What do you do on your day-to-day, sort of as a worker in government, to fight the private equity?
Yeah, well, so I served as special counsel for private equity in the antitrust division, and I played a small role in pursuing various investigations that would, address some of the antitrust concerns that private equity firms face. So, for instance, it's illegal for a private equity firm to appoint to the boards of various companies that it doesn't own directors if those, directors on the board of directors, if those companies compete with each other. So to use an imaginary example, if you're on the board of Delta, you can't also be on the board of Southwest. Again, that's just a hypothetical example. One of the things that's really important to, sort of observe, to police, is whether private equity firms are using their power to appoint board members to competing companies, because that's a great way for those companies to coordinate, to collude with one another in a way that hurts consumers. So that's, one thing that I played a small role in. Candidly, I'm no longer in government. So, now that I'm in private practice, I work at a law firm that in part sues companies that mistreat workers and consumers. So I try to do in the private sector what I was doing in the public sector.
Mhm. So critics say this is simply capitalism and efficiency, which you touched on. What makes private equity different from responsible investment, and are there cases where private equity has created broad value?
Yeah, so this is the sort of standard critique of private equity, that this is essentially just some form of extreme capitalism. And what I've always argued is that private equity is not an extreme form of capitalism, but rather a perversion of capitalism. And the reason that is goes back to the issues that we were talking about at the very beginning here. The idea that a private equity firm can capture all the financial upside of buying a business when things go well, but can walk away entirely when things go poorly. That sort of severs the basic relationship we want to have with risk in a capitalist system. Because if you're able to socialize the risk to consumers, to portfolio companies that you should bear as a private equity firm, if you're able to offshore or socialize that risk, suddenly we don't really have a system that works. And instead, we have a system that really benefits the institutions that are able to manipulate or navigate our legal system and our political system.
Many private equity investors are public pension funds and endowments. What responsibility do they have, and what specific commitments should they demand before allocating money?
Once again, I hate to be repetitive here, but it's a great question. So, as you alluded to, pension funds are involved in private equity firms. When we were talking about the basic business model earlier, typically what happens is a private equity firm will invest a little bit of its own money. There will be a lot of debt involved, borrowed money, but some of the money will come from other investors. So, like you said, pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, and so forth. These investors, what are sometimes called limited partners, have enormous power over a private equity firm. And they can play a role in setting the standards for how a private equity firm is going to operate. They can demand certain quality controls. They can demand that private equity firms treat the workers and the consumers at the companies they buy with dignity and fairly. And they can demand that these companies invest for the long term rather than just trying to make short-term financial gains here. And so, we've seen examples like that. One industry where private equity firms have been really active in recent years has been the prison phone industry. And there, the some pension funds reportedly were really involved in pushing private equity firms to take a less extractive approach to that industry, stop charging such outrageous amounts for individual prison phone calls. So there is not just the possibility, but there's also the precedent for these endowments and pension funds to really play a positive role in how private equity firms operate. And so, if you are a teacher, if you're a firefighter, if you're a cop, you actually have a pretty significant voice in shaping how private equity firms operate, and you can use that voice to make them more responsible.
If nothing changes, what do you expect the American economy to look like in 2035 under continued private equity expansion? And what actions by policymakers, enforcers, investors, and citizens give you hope that we can change that path?
Yeah. So if we do nothing, I think the economy as we know it will be vastly different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Right now you can still go to a family, an individually owned dentist clinic or a family owned veterinary clinic. And oftentimes, I'm not saying that those businesses are perfect. Oftentimes you encounter a bad dentist or a bad veterinarian or whatever it happens to be. But there's lots of benefits to those sorts of small businesses. Not only does it, do you have the flexibility and the relationships with these people that provide services, those people, when they provide those services, make money from providing those services, typically keep their wealth in the local community. If we do nothing, private equity firms are going to buy up all these small businesses. They're going to roll them up and make them part of large corporations. And it means that rather than going to a local dentist clinic, a local veterinary clinic, you're going to go to a large corporate office, one that doesn't have relationships, one that doesn't have flexibility, one that, because of its market power, is going to be able to charge more than those local offices would be able to do. And perhaps most concerningly, or at least one of the concerning issues here, is that when it's these large companies that own these businesses, the money doesn't stay in the community. The money goes to a handful of large investors that live in a handful of cities. And I worry that that is going to exacerbate inequality, economic inequality, and I think it's going to exacerbate political divisions in our country because of that inequality if we do nothing. But to get to the second part of your question, we don't have to do nothing. There are things that we can do. We've been talking about the basic problems here about private equity firms loading companies up with debt, extracting a lot of fees, being insulated from liability. There's stuff that Congress could do, although Congress, really doesn't pass bills in the way that we would want anymore. So, if Congress can't act, I think we can ask states and localities to. We can ask states to pass legislation to say, if you, a private equity firm, buy up a business and drive it into the ground in a couple of years, you should be financially responsible for that. If you mistreat your workers or underinvest, or deliberately harm your customers, you can be responsible for that. And that's not changing capitalism at all. That's just bringing private equity back into the fold of capitalism, making it work the way that the capitalist system is supposed to work. So, it's extremely concerning, the idea that we might do nothing, but there are things that we can do, and I hope we do.
So if America will change so much in the last 10 years, has private equity just started ramping up in recent years, or has it been a long-lasting thing, if that makes sense?
It's, ironically, I would say it's both, in that, the private equity industry really has been operating in its modern form since the 1980s. So, we've had a long history of it. Especially during COVID, there was a huge burst of private equity activity. A ton of businesses were getting bought up. That's sort of fallen off lately. I think people paid too much for companies, and the private equity firms, many of them are struggling to some degree. But I think we've already seen a lot of changes because of the private equity industry. If going to an ER is a more difficult, more dangerous proposition than it was a few decades ago, that in large part can be explained by the fact that private equity firms have been buying up emergency medical practices. If you feel that nursing homes have been getting worse in the past few years, again, that can in large part be explained by private equity firms. Finally, if you think that the retail industry has been losing a ton of jobs, that can in part be explained by private equity firms buying up a ton of businesses in retail. And so, whether people see it or not, because it's often hard to understand what's caused by private equity, whether or not they see it, almost everybody's life has been influenced to some degree or another by private equity in the past few years.
Hmm. So this is more of a personal question, but as a junior in high school who hopes to go to a good university, how did you like your time at Columbia and Stanford?
Oh, I had a blast. And as you're thinking about school, wherever you apply, wherever you go, you're going to have a wonderful time. I can tell you're an extremely smart, very innovative guy. And so I have no doubt that wherever you decide to go, those qualities are going to serve you well. And so I hope you consider those schools, but know that what is going to make you successful is not those schools. It's going to be the stuff that's already inside of you.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. And lastly, we ask all of our interviewees, how do you define success personally and professionally?
Hmm. I've never really thought about that question, and it's a very good one. It's a little trite, but I'd say, have you made the world that you get experience a little bit better while you're here? And have you cared about the people that are around you? Ultimately, absolutely nobody is going to remember how much money you made. Nobody's really going to remember what job titles you had. The only thing that's going to matter is if you tried to improve the world and if you were successful.